While I worked a double shift on Christmas Day, my kids went to his grandparents. But they told him they weren't doing grandkids this year. The kids sat outside for 3 hours before driving themselves home. I didn't make a scene. The next morning, I sent them a text with a simple PDF, and within an hour, my phone lit up with 21 missed calls and a voicemail. I, 34 had been pulling double shifts at the hospital for years, but working Christmas Day always hit different. The ER doesn't close for holidays, and someone has to be there when families are carving turkey and the inevitable kitchen accidents start rolling in. My ex-wife got the kids most holidays under our custody arrangement, but this year she was traveling with her new boyfriend, so the kids were with me for Christmas week. The plan was simple. I'd work the double shift on Christmas Day, 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., and my parents had promised to host the kids. They'd done it before without issue. My son was 16 and my daughter 14, old enough to handle themselves, but still young enough to want that Christmas magic. I'd left them with wrapped presents to open in the morning, told them Grandma and Grandpa were expecting them at noon, and headed out before dawn. The shift was brutal. 3 car accidents, 2 heart attacks, and a kid who'd swallowed a Lego Santa. I didn't check my phone until my break at 8 p.m., figuring the kids were stuffed with ham and probably falling asleep watching some Christmas movie at my parents' place. That's when I saw 17 missed calls from my son. My stomach dropped before I even listened to the voicemail. His voice was quiet, controlled in that way teenagers get when they're trying not to cry. He told me they'd driven to Grandma and Grandpa's house at noon like planned. They'd knocked, and my father answered. He said they weren't doing grandkids this year, that it was just going to be him and Mom. Then he closed the door. My son said they sat in the car for 3 hours in my parents' driveway, thinking maybe there was a misunderstanding. The temperature was in the 20s. They could see the lights on inside, could see shadows moving past the windows. Finally, they drove home and spent Christmas afternoon in our empty apartment, eating the leftovers I'd prepared for the 26th. I called my son immediately. He sounded tired, defeated. He said his sister had cried most of the way home. He tried calling me, but knew I couldn't answer during shifts unless it was an emergency. He didn't want to make me leave work. That gutted me more than anything. My kid protecting me while sitting rejected in a freezing car on Christmas. I asked if my parents had given any explanation. He said no, just that they weren't doing grandkids this year. Like my children were a holiday decoration they decided not to put up. I asked if they'd seemed angry or upset. He said no, just cold. Matter of fact. I finished my shift on autopilot. Every patient became a blur. All I could think about was my kids sitting in that driveway, watching their grandparents' house, wondering what they'd done wrong. I got home at midnight to find them both asleep on the couch, the TV still playing some old Christmas movie neither had actually been watching. I spent the rest of that night awake, trying to understand. My parents and I had our differences. They disapproved of my divorce. Thought I should have tried harder to make it work even though my ex-wife had been the one who left. They made comments sometimes about my work schedule, implied I wasn't around enough for the kids. But this was a different level. The next morning, I called my mother. She answered cheerful, asked how my shift went. I asked her directly what had happened yesterday. There was a pause, and then she said exactly what my father had told the kids. They decided not to do grandkids this year, just wanted a quiet Christmas. Her tone suggested this was perfectly reasonable. I asked why they hadn't told me. She said they'd assumed I'd figure it out. I asked why they'd let the kids sit outside for 3 hours. She said she didn't know they were still there, that they should have just left. The casual cruelty in her voice was stunning. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just told her I understood and ended the call. My son was watching from the kitchen doorway. He asked what Grandma had said. I told him she confirmed they'd decided not to see him and his sister this Christmas. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer but hoped for something different. The rage came later, after the kids went to their rooms. Not the hot, explosive kind, the cold, calculating kind that sits in your chest and demands action. My parents had humiliated my children, had made them feel unwanted on Christmas, and had done it without warning or explanation. And they clearly felt justified. I spent Boxing Day doing research. I pulled up my parents' will. They'd given me a copy years ago when they'd first had it drafted, back when we were still on good terms. I reviewed the trust documents. I called an attorney friend and asked some hypothetical questions about estate planning and grandchildren's rights. What I found was interesting. My parents had established a trust fund for my kids years ago, before the divorce. It wasn't massive, about $80,000 total, but it was meant for their college education. The trust documents specifically named my son and daughter as beneficiaries and stipulated the funds were to be released when they turned 18. But there was a clause I'd forgotten about. The trust could be modified or revoked by my parents at any time before the kids turned 18, as long as they provided written notice to all parties. They'd never modified it, never mentioned changing it. But after yesterday, I had to wonder if that was coming. I spent the next day creating a document. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. Just a clear, factual PDF outlining the events of Christmas Day, timestamped with the phone records showing my son's 17 calls to me. I included screenshots of the text exchange where I'd confirmed with my mother 2 weeks earlier that she and Dad were expecting the kids at noon on Christmas. I added a brief, emotionless summary of the conversation I'd had with her the morning after. Then I added one more section. A formal request that my parents clarify their intentions regarding the trust fund established for my children, given their stated decision to no longer include grandchildren in family gatherings. I noted that while I respected their right to manage their social calendar as they wished, I wanted to ensure my kids had clarity about their financial future so we could plan accordingly. I didn't threaten. I didn't accuse. I just laid out the facts and asked a reasonable question. On December 27th at 6 a.m., I sent the PDF to my parents via text message. Then I sent copies to my 2 siblings, my older brother and younger sister, who I knew would be at my parents' house later that morning for the traditional day after Christmas breakfast. I included a brief message saying I wanted them aware of the situation. Then I took my kids out for breakfast at their favorite diner and turned my phone off. We spent 3 hours eating pancakes, talking about their school plans for the new semester, looking at college brochures for my son who'd be starting applications next year. Normal parent stuff. The stuff my parents had made impossible on Christmas. When I turned my phone back on at 10 a.m., it exploded. 21 missed calls. 14 from my mother, 7 from my father. 6 texts from my brother ranging from confused to angry to panicked. 3 texts from my sister that were just question marks. And 1 voicemail from my father that I listened to while standing in the diner parking lot. His voice was shaking. He demanded I call him immediately. He said what I'd sent was inappropriate and manipulative. He said I was twisting the situation to make them look bad. He said the trust fund was none of my siblings' business, and I had no right to involve them. He said I was being vindictive and cruel. The voicemail was 2 minutes long, and he never once mentioned my kids. I didn't call back. Instead, I sent a simple text to both parents. I'm happy to discuss this when you're ready to explain to your grandchildren why they weren't welcome on Christmas. Until then, we have nothing to talk about. My brother called 10 minutes later. He was livid, but not at me. He wanted to know if what I'd written was true. I confirmed every detail. He went quiet for a long moment, then said he'd had no idea, that Mom and Dad had told him and our sister they were having a quiet Christmas alone, no kids or grandkids from anyone. He said he'd assumed that meant all the grandchildren, that it was a mutual decision. I asked if they'd ever done that before. He said no, never. Then he asked about the trust fund clause. I explained my concern that given their willingness to cut my kids out without warning, I needed to know if they planned to revoke the education fund too. He understood immediately. He said he'd talk to our sister and they'd handle it. I told him I appreciated it, but this was my situation to manage. He said no, it wasn't anymore. Our parents had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to watch them damage their relationship with their grandkids over whatever grudge they were holding against me. My sister called an hour later. She was crying. She'd apparently confronted our mother directly at the breakfast, demanded to know why my kids had been turned away. My mother had tried to deflect, said it was complicated, said I was making a bigger deal out of it than necessary. My sister had pressed, and eventually my mother admitted they decided my kids needed to learn that actions have consequences. When my sister asked what that meant, my mother said I'd chosen my career over my family, that I was never around, that the kids were growing up without proper guidance. She said she and Dad had decided not to reward that behavior by continuing to play doting grandparents when I clearly didn't value family time. In other words, they'd punish my children for my perceived parenting failures. On Christmas, without warning, my sister told me she'd called our mother a heartless monster and left. She said our brother was still there, having a much calmer but apparently more devastating conversation with our father. She asked what I needed from her. I said I just needed my kids to know they hadn't done anything wrong. She said she'd come over that afternoon and tell them herself. The calls from my parents continued throughout the day. I ignored all of them. My kids asked what was happening. I told them the truth in age-appropriate terms, that Grandma and Grandpa had made a decision that hurt them, that other family members were upset about it, and that sometimes adults make bad choices that have bigger consequences than they expect. My daughter asked if this was her fault for not calling Grandma more often. That question nearly broke me. I sat her down and told her explicitly that nothing about this was her fault, that she was a kid and grown-ups were responsible for maintaining relationships, not the other way around. My sister arrived at 2 p.m. with presents for both kids and spent 2 hours with us. She told my son and daughter directly that what their grandparents had done was wrong, that she loved them, that they were wanted and valued. My daughter cried. My son stayed quiet but hugged his aunt for a long time when she left. The evening brought a new development. My mother sent a long text message. She said she and my father wanted to explain themselves, that they loved the kids, that this had all gotten out of hand. She said they'd made a mistake in how they handled things. She said they wanted to make it right. Notably, she didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the cruelty of what they'd done. She framed it as a miscommunication that had escalated due to my reaction. I responded with one line. An apology to your grandchildren would be a good start. She called immediately. I answered on speaker with the kids' permission. They were in the room, and I wanted them to hear this directly. My mother's voice was strained. She said she was sorry the kids had been hurt, that she and Grandpa hadn't meant for them to sit outside, that they should have communicated better. My daughter started to respond, but I held up a hand. I asked my mother directly, "Are you sorry you turned them away? Or are you sorry they found out you turned them away?" Silence. Then my mother said this whole thing was about me, not the kids. She said I'd always been defensive about my parenting, that I couldn't handle criticism, that I was turning the kids against them now by making them listen to this conversation. I told her she'd turn them away on Christmas and let them sit outside in the cold for 3 hours. I asked what part of that was about me. She said I was twisting her words. She said family was supposed to forgive. She said I was being vindictive by involving my siblings and bringing up the trust fund. I told her the trust fund question was legitimate. If she was willing to revoke their Christmas, why would I trust the education fund was safe? That's when my father took the phone. His voice was hard. He said the trust fund was secure and I had no right to question it. He said I was manipulating the situation and trying to make them look like villains. He said I owed them an apology for sending that document to my siblings. I asked if he thought he owed his grandchildren an apology for closing the door on them on Christmas. He said they were making a point about respect and family priorities. I asked if humiliating 2 kids was really the best way to make that point. He said I was the one who'd humiliated them by exposing a private family matter. I ended the call. My son looked at me and said he didn't want to see them again. My daughter nodded in agreement. I told them that was their choice and I'd support it, but that feelings might change over time, and that was okay too. For now, we'd take space. The next 2 days brought a flurry of family drama. My brother and sister both cut contact with our parents temporarily. My brother sent me a message saying he'd consulted with an attorney friend and confirmed that the trust fund couldn't be touched without notification to all parties, and that given the circumstances, any attempt to modify it now would likely be challenged successfully. My sister organized a New Year's gathering at her place specifically for my kids, making it clear they were loved and wanted. Several extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, reached out after hearing what happened, all of them expressing support and dismay. My parents sent several more messages attempting to reframe the narrative. They claimed they'd been trying to teach the kids independence. They said holidays had become too commercialized anyway. They said I was alienating them from their grandchildren over a simple misunderstanding. I didn't engage. The facts spoke for themselves. They'd confirmed they'd host the kids. They'd turned them away without warning. They'd left them sitting outside in the cold. They'd offered no real apology. And they'd made it clear this was about punishing me through my children. The PDF I'd sent hadn't been revenge in the traditional sense. It was documentation. But the effect was the same. They'd been exposed to the family for exactly who they were, and they couldn't spin it. The facts were time-stamped, screenshotted, undeniable. By New Year's Eve, my parents sent a final message through my sister. They wanted to meet in person to resolve this properly. My sister said they seemed shaken, that the reality of potentially losing access to their grandchildren and facing family disapproval had apparently hit home. I told my sister I'd consider it after they sent a written apology to my kids. Not to me, to the kids directly, acknowledging what they'd done and why it was wrong. That was 3 days ago. No apology has arrived yet. My kids spent New Year's Eve at my sister's house with their cousins, laughing and playing games and eating too much junk food. They seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. My daughter told me she'd been nervous around Grandma and Grandpa for a while, always worried about saying the wrong thing. My son admitted he'd felt like they judged him constantly. I thought I was protecting them by maintaining the relationship with my parents despite our differences. Turns out I'd been teaching them to accept mistreatment from people who claimed to love them. The trust fund remains intact. My attorney friend confirmed the documents are solid and any attempt to modify them now would be legally questionable given the circumstances and documentation. My parents' leverage, if they'd thought they had any, evaporated the moment I made the situation transparent. I don't know if my parents will ever apologize genuinely. I don't know if my kids will want a relationship with them eventually. What I do know is that the simple act of documenting the truth and refusing to let it be buried or reframed has shifted everything. My phone hasn't stopped ringing from extended family checking in, offering support, sharing their own stories of times my parents had been casually cruel in ways they'd dismissed or ignored. The pattern was there all along, apparently. It just took my kids sitting in a cold car on Christmas for everyone to finally see it clearly. I'm not vindictive. I'm just done protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. My parents decided my kids weren't worth their time on Christmas. I decided to let everyone know exactly what that looked like. Sometimes revenge isn't about doing something terrible to someone who wronged you. Sometimes it's just about refusing to hide what they did. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.